My name is Cale Carter, and today we're going to continue our historical examination of the 25th Infantry Regiment in World War II. Now, the previous video I did served as an introduction of the 25th Infantry Regiment, as well as covered their experiences stateside. So if you wish to see that video, I'll have a link down below so you can watch it. But continue where we left off, the 25th Infantry Regiment in early January 1944 began to be deployed in elements to the Pacific Theater of Operations, more specifically Guadalcanal, and that deployment was complete in March of 1944. Now, initially when the 25th Infantry arrived in Guadalcanal, they primarily did labor detail. They primarily helped out with offloading supplies, helping with stuff like that. But they also got a crash course in jungle warfare. And also during this time period that there was at Guadalcanal, the 25th Infantry Regiment became the 25th Regimental Combat Team. Now, for those that don't know what a Regimental Combat Team is, a Regimental Combat Team is basically a small unit within the U.S. Army. Well, not really a small unit, but basically a regiment-sized unit that has been reinforced with elements of field artillery and other elements to make the unit able to operate independently of a combat division. So, in the case of the 25th Infantry Regiment, when they became the 25th Regimental Combat Team, the 593rd Artillery Battalion was also attached to the 25th Regimental Combat Team, elements of the 596th Field Artillery Battalion, and of course elements from the Combat Engineer and Medical detachments of the 93rd Infantry Division. So in late March 1944, the 25th Regimental Combat Team is deployed to Bougainville, and the reason for being deployed to Bougainville was to help shore up the Allied combat units there that have established a defensive perimeter around the Allied air bases in the area. Now, as I mentioned before, in the Pacific Theater of Operations, because of how warfare tended to be, the Japanese, they would oftentimes, rarely if ever, surrender. Meaning that while we may have a date where we say, okay, like in the case of Guadalcanal, for example, the island of Guadalcanal may be declared secure on this date, but we still would have to have forces there to protect our air bases or garrisons, because you still ran the risk of encountering Japanese holdouts. And in the case of Bougainville, it was no different. There was still a sizable Japanese presence that was on Bougainville. So when the 25th Regimental Combat Team was deployed to Bougainville, in addition to helping shore up the Allied combat units in the defensive perimeter, they also were tasked to go on the offensive and help establish ambush points along areas that the Japanese forces, or the remnant Japanese forces, were known to travel through during the nighttime. Now, initially when the 25th Regimental Combat Team first arrives in Bougainville and they see service, the individual battalions were attached to the already experienced white units who were in the area, primarily units from the Medical Division, which will later be known as the 23rd Infantry Division. And during their initial deployment there, they actually proved themselves to be pretty competent in fighting. In fact, there's a few skirmishes here and there where people say, well, they're doing sufficient, they're doing pretty well acclimating to jungle warfare in spite of their limited training in the regard. Now, however, this all gets called into question after a skirmish that will later become known as the Battle for Hill 250. Now, the Battle for Hill 250 actually gets its start on April 5th, 1944. And the idea was that K Company from the 3rd Battalion of the 25th Regimental Combat Team would be deployed to go out and set up an ambush where Japanese forces would come down a specified trail. Now, to keep in mind, in comparison to the other battalions, the 3rd Battalion of the 25th Regimental Combat Team, while they might have had some limited training, they weren't as acclimated to combat in the jungle like the other battalions were. In fact, they were still kind of getting to the point of being acclimated to the jungle. So, K Company, before it sets out on this mission, was reinforced to a strength of about 150 soldiers. So, in addition to the platoons within K Company, you also had Ford artillery observers from the 593rd. You also had four soldiers who were from a signal corps unit, and the idea was to document this company's early, like basically one of the company's largest engagements. And also you had an intelligence analyst who was from the 164th Infantry. And the reason for the intelligence analyst being there was to help establish where the Japanese trail was, as well as to help them set up the ambush. So initially everything goes to plan until they come across an abandoned Japanese hospital. When they come across the Japanese hospital, the scouting elements of K Company were sent out to try to figure out where the Japanese were, like figure out if there were still Japanese in the area, because there was some telltale signs at the hospital that there was still some Japanese that just recently left. So the scouts get detached, they go out, they try to examine and figure out where the Japanese were, and that's when all hell breaks loose. The scouting detachments take fire, and at the same time they begin to take fire, the main platoons begin to take fire. And the issue that comes about that ultimately plagues the 25th and not only the 25th but the 93rd Infantry Division as a whole was not the combat itself, but how the unit withdrew from combat. So, according to records that I've read up to this point, there has been kind of some conflict about what officially happened. Some say that the captain gave the order to the first platoon to go ahead and withdraw and get back to a defensive perimeter so they can basically do a defensive fallback where you have one unit covering another. So, or it's confusing in the fact that if he gave one platoon or did he give all platoons, but either way, from the looks of it and from the records, he most likely gave one platoon the order. But because of the chaos and confusion of the firefight, people that was part of the first platoon that pulled back were people that was from other platoons. Like, wait a minute, they're pulling back. Are they leaving us behind too? Are they going to leave us to get caught in this ambush? So ultimately, for fear of being abandoned out in the jungle without support, you had soldiers that were in essence routed. Now, the difference between a retreat and a rout is that retreats are normally orderly. Normally, when you call for a retreat, it's normally an orderly process. You have people covering and providing basically cover fire. A rout is usually when it's basically a situation where people are panicked, or it's a situation where defense is not possible, and the only way to survive is literally to just drop everything and evacuate as soon as physically possible. So, needless to say, because of fear that the units will get cut off or units will get overpowered by Japanese firepower, units begin to pull back. And ultimately, when everything is said and done, approximately 10 soldiers are killed, 20 are wounded, and equipment was left out in the battlefield. So in addition to the casualties, such as the dead being left behind, there was also rifles left behind. There was 2 automatic rifles and even a radio left behind. Now, after that, there was attempts to try to recover those items, but even the attempts to recover those items led to more casualties. So, when you combine what I just stated, as well as the report from the intelligence analyst who said that, well, these guys didn't know how to perform under fire. This led to an investigation, and in addition to the investigation, it also led to the belief that, see, well, these guys were not cut out for combat. Now, the grand irony about this entire situation is that a lot of people came back and said, well, given that this element of the 25th Regimental Combat Team wasn't experienced in conjunction with the fact that they were fighting in the jungle, sometimes this does lead to similar situations. And in fact, there was a handful of similar situation that was recorded within white units who were exposed. In fact, there was a story about it was a platoon from a white regiment that was in a similar situation, and looking back, upon examining the case, they actually had the firepower to actually overwhelm the Japanese that was shooting at them, but because they was in the jungle, there was confusion about where the shots were coming from and everything else, that led to that unit, in essence, doing a panic retreat or rout as well. So, ultimately, the irony about the entire situation is that after the battle for Hill 250, the 25th Regimental Combat Team still proved itself to be admirable in combat. And in fact, I think there was a skirmish that occurred about a few days after the Battle of Hill 250, where you had a squad that came across that got into a Japanese firefight, and they ultimately end up basically defeating the attackers and repelling them. So while they still performed admirably in combat, you still had the Battle of Hill 250 that weighed heavy on a lot of folks' mind. So after their time at Bougainville, the 25th Regimental Combat Team was bounced around for a short bit. First, they moved to the Green Islands, and while they was there, they helped do labor details and construction details, and they also spent time basically getting reacclimated to combat training. And then later they was deployed to New Guinea to do the same thing. And during that time period, they spent pretty much from July 1944 to March 1945 doing those type of details. Now, by March 1945, the 25th Regimental Combat Team was deployed to Morotai, which was an island in the Dutch East Indies. And it was during this point that the 25th Regimental Combat Team was reattached to the 93rd Infantry Division. And pretty much the goal while they were stationed at Morotai was to continue what they did before, which was labor details and training, but also they were supposed to do defensive operations as well as do reconnaissance patrols to weed out the remaining Japanese forces that was on the island. Now, it was while on this island the 25th Regimental Combat Team did arguably the most amazing feat of any unit in the Pacific Theater in World War II. Now, in August 1945, just right before the war ended, well, really, let me backtrack a little bit. When the 25th Regimental Combat Team was deployed to the island, one of their main goals was to capture Colonel Uichi. And Colonel Uichi was the commander of the 211th Infantry Regiment that was a part of the 32nd Imperial Japanese Army Division. The idea was to either capture him or eliminate him so that way they can try to capitulate the remaining forces. But it was stressed that the idea was to capture him. So in August of 1945, a few days before the war ended, actually, a patrol from the 25th Regimental Combat Team actually managed to capture Colonel Uichi. Now, normally this would not be a big deal because, after all, you just managed to capture a colonel. But the big deal about it was that they managed to capture a Japanese colonel alive prior to the end of World War II. Now, the reason why this is a big deal is because up to that point, most Japanese officers would either kill themselves or die in combat. So the fact that they managed to capture a Japanese colonel alive is no small feat. So After they capture Colonel Uichi, the resistance begins to tamper down, and before you know it, the war ends. Now, as after World War II ends, the 32nd the 32nd Imperial Japanese Army Division surrenders to the 93rd Infantry Division, and after that, the 25th Regimental Combat Team pretty much stays in the Pacific Theater until January 1946. In January 1946, the 25th Infantry Regiment, as well as the remaining elements of the 93rd Infantry Division, was brought back to Camp Stoneman, California, where it was officially demobilized and deactivated in February 1946. Now, the interesting thing about the 25th Infantry Regiment is that shortly after being deactivated in Camp Stoneman, it was shortly reactivated again for a short time. And after it was reactivated, the individual battalions were broken up to form their own battalion. So the 1st Battalion became the 25th Armored Infantry Battalion, the 2nd Battalion became the 94th Armored Infantry, and the 3rd Battalion became the 95th Infantry, or the Armored Infantry Battalion. Now, ultimately, after that, the 25th Infantry, as we knew it, became officially deactivated in 1950. So that right there was the history of the 25th Infantry Regiment, both stateside and in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Now, as I said before, overall the 25th Infantry Regiment performed its duties admirably, given the circumstances that the unit was deployed in. Now, with that said, the controversies, which we will continue to see, especially when it comes to not only the 93rd Infantry Division, the 93rd Infantry Division, but other black units, is that, and this will actually be a reoccurring theme in these history videos, is that normally with these black units, when there is one event that occurs that puts the unit in a bad light, that record will follow that unit throughout its tenure, no matter how well the unit ultimately proves itself. So I want people to keep that in mind when they not only hear about these stories, but also if they go research the history of black units, to try to understand the context of what happened. So this completes the end of the 25th Infantry Regiment. Next time, the next video I'll be working on will be the 364th Infantry Regiment, and I'll put it this way: if the 25th Infantry Regiment seems like it had a lot of controversies, just wait till we talk about the 364th. But again, given that we're looking at this from a historical perspective, I will try to do my best to provide context and explain as to why that happened. So, I thank you for taking time to watch this video. I thank you for subscribing and sharing this video, and hopefully I'll see y'all again soon.